everyone. Good morning. I am going to try to explain resilience today in terms of its definition. What are some of the terms that are included in the definitions? What do those mean? How do we value resilience, measure resilience, and also present some stakeholder approaches to solving and present those solutions. Following my presentation, you'll hear a lot from other folks today that are going to go in depth into each of those topics and explain it with examples. So we'll get started here. All right, we'll start with a very contentious slide. Differences between reliability and resilience. In 2022, Enro had 34 interviewees from NYSERDA and tried to give them options of resilience-related events, the planning processes associated with it, reliability-related events, the planning process associated with it, just to get the differences on what they think. The general consensus with all 34 interviewees was that resilience is definitely a broader concept compared to reliability. Even though there is a little bit of trade-off between reliability and resilience, a generally resilient system is considered more reliable as well. Purely thinking in terms of definitions, I like to consider three elements: event characteristics, spatial extent, economic losses. Is the event that you're looking at affecting the grid under normal operating conditions? Or is it affecting it to have a black sky operating condition and causing a lot of stress to the system? Is it only affecting a concentrated area of your service territory or a big geographical region or even your entire service territory? Is it only resulting in unserved load for a subset of customers, or is it causing cascading events to the economy, for instance, degraded water quality due to a power loss? Those are some concepts to think about just from the definition point of view. Let's get into the actual definition of resilience. The ability to, you're going to hear a lot of definitions for resilience today. The one that we've used at Enroll since 2014 is this one that encompasses a lot of key elements from the Presidential Policy Directive 21. The key elements are prepare for, withstand, respond to, and recover. I like to think of this definition in two parts. The ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions is part one. To withstand, respond to, and rapidly recover from disruptions is part two. The first part is the action part, right? You're thinking about planning. The second part is the reaction part. You've planned. Is your system reacting accordingly? A common knowledge gap that I see in research world, even in the utility world, between these two parts is the first part where you're planning for and you're preparing your grid is usually through investments. And you're doing it in dollars. The second part, the reaction part, is understanding whether the investment that you made is resulting in the intended benefit. And how are you measuring that? Is that also going to be monetary? Is it in dollars? Are we bridging that gap? Is that equation balanced? All of those questions are the knowledge gap currently. Usually, resilience can be measured as systems performance, subject to both acute shocks and chronic stresses. What is the system that we're talking about? In general, this is where a vulnerability can be assessed. So this could be anything like an engineered system, like a power grid, or a social system like a community, a geographical system like a military installation or a small campus. And the shocks and stressors usually relate to natural events that are hazards, human-caused events, and systemic challenges. In general, shocks are associated with acute events like storms or hurricanes, and stressors are the factors that describe systems' effect over long periods of time. They're not mutually exclusive. Usually, they can and often do compound on one another, and an impact of a short-term shock is exacerbated or being exacerbated, exacerbates or being exacerbated by long-term stressors that are facing the system. All that said, from this slide, if there's a thing or two that I would take away is that definition of resilience and the idea that it is contextual. Ideally, we would want our system to be resilient for all threats all the time, but in reality, a system that's resilient to one hazard or one threat might not be resilient to another. A perfect example of this would be Winter Storm Uri. Texas was adequately prepared to handle heat-related stresses, but the ones from Uri were cold and precipitation that the grid was not equipped to handle. All right, now we're looking at an approach to evaluating or assessing and planning resilience. The one on the left is the high-level overview of what we use at Enroll. The first step being assessing baseline of your power grid. This includes what kind of data set can you and do you collect from your system? What are the component level information that you hold? Do you model your customers? Do you model the secondary network of your system? So assessing the baseline of where your grid is. Identifying and scoring hazards and vulnerabilities. This also includes, do you have the ability and the resources to collect the data to point to hazards that are either historic or future related. Analyzing risks that are leading to the hazards, identifying solutions to reduce those risks, developing an action plan to implement the solutions that you are coming up with. As you can see, this is cyclic and an iterative process because you can't just design and implement a solution that's going to work 100% of the time. It is important to incorporate continuous improvement strategies to evaluate what works and what is less effective in your grid. The Argonne process outlined on the right has similarities where it's important to understand how resilience ties into state energy planning from generation, transmission, distribution to the end users. These two frameworks demonstrate the importance that stakeholder concerns and goals need to be integrated in every part of this planning process and reiterated. Okay. Well, oversimplifying a very complex topic, if utilities addressing resilience planning, at a minimum, they need to look at least these three components. Threats and hazards. Are they looking at understanding what are more likely in their geographical region, especially from the point of view of the facility that needs to be sustained? Are they understanding the historic and the future performance of the infrastructure that is supporting these communities and the consequences? For me, in this slide, a good thing to point out is that we look at reliability and can understand a lot of it. From resilience point of view, we're usually talking about events that are on the tail end of these curves. We're thinking about the events that are rare but hugely impactful, and hence an infrastructure disruption that are very few in number but are most extreme in size and scale, and eventually consequences that are rare but are the most extreme. All right, I threw around a lot of terms. Hazards, threats, vulnerabilities, consequence. Let's pause on this slide, take a moment to understand these definitions. A lot of this will be reiterated throughout the day, so we kind of have time to sink in these terms. Hazard is anything or a system that can expose a vulnerability, either intentionally or unintentionally, and can damage, destroy, or disrupt the power sector. It can be natural, technological, or human caused, typically not within the operator's control, and can include wildfires, hurricanes, storms, cyber attacks, and so on. It is often interchangeably used with threat, something that's likely to cause damage or danger to the power sector. Vulnerability is a weakness in the system, which when exposed can lead to negative consequences. Typically, vulnerabilities are within control and can be mitigated to avoid exposure to the system. Consequence has a direct effect or a significant effect on something such as the power sector. We touched on this a little bit before, but I want to give a quick example to what these shocks and stressors can be. The natural threats could be anything from tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, avalanches, droughts, storms, wildfires, just to name a few. Human-caused events could be physical attacks, like the Metcalf substation event, or a cyber attack, like the Colonial Pipeline. Systemic issues, this is my favorite one, these include the vulnerable population that either do not have the resource to evacuate an area quickly because of lack of having a personal vehicle, or just the general lack of resources to rebuild and recover from an event. The types of systems, we talked about it. Tom was going to go into more detail about each of these systems and the risks associated with them. All right, so we've defined resilience. We looked at the terms that are encompassing resilience. We'll look at each of those terms and how they can be calculated and measured. For the first one, understanding risks. In order for a utility to understand what are their high-risk hazards, they should probably look at all of their hazards and relatively arrange them in terms of their risk number, right? What is that risk number? At NRO, we use the definition of probability times vulnerability times consequence. Probability and vulnerability are engineering estimates that use power grid's age and performance data in general, and consequence is the customer criticality rating. Argonne National Lab's presentation will dive more into it with specific examples. But also when utility is looking at risks, they also want to look at emerging risks that are considered proactively, and this is possible through climate data. Okay, vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are typically the weaknesses in the system, just to reiterate the definition. It usually fits into two categories, infrastructure or process vulnerabilities. Both types of vulnerabilities need to be considered when you're planning for resilience. That's why we use a risk-informed, stakeholder-driven approach to get there. Infrastructure vulnerabilities are often the easier one to address, but they tend to be very expensive, like pole hardening, large infrastructure development like GIS mapping for your service territory. Process vulnerabilities are quite difficult to address, but are the inexpensive options. This could include employee training, capacity trainings, developments of codes and standards when you're looking at the process of the power grid. With that, we can shift the thinking from looking at just the disruptions to the power grid to the implications of those disruptions to the power grid, and that's what we call consequence. It's usually looked at in three different domains: societal consequence, economic consequence, and national security level consequences. Societal consequences, it could include anything from a larger group scenario, like breakdowns in community cohesion, to smaller ones, like was the consumer able to get to food and groceries today? Did the diabetic patient have a refrigerator to store their insulin? And also whether people are able to heat or cool their houses. Very basic. Economic consequences are direct and indirect causes. Direct causes is an industry directly affected in terms of its performance by a disruption event. Indirect consequences, because an industry was affected in an area of outage, are there consequences in goods and services produced by that industry to the people that were not affected? National security, anything that can inhibit economic growth or trigger job loss. Recently, the Department of Defense has acknowledged that we are having national security level consequences due to disruptions. Okay, that's all of the definitions, concepts, key terms. We're going to look at how to measure resilience. Forget the figure on the left. We've seen that figure all the time. What we want to understand from there is that with each phases of the resilience, we want to collect metrics. In the second figure, this is my favorite one. A lot of utilities think about measuring resilience from a purely performance point of view. If you think about the definition, the second part, the reaction part is where they're measuring the metrics, right? But there's also the first part where you're planning for it. And metrics need to be associated with that part as well. These are called attribute metrics. Attribute metrics helps characterize the system and the ability to anticipate, absorb, withstand, or recover from. Usually, attribute metrics can give utilities with the options to improve performance metrics. So if you look at the bottom, you have anticipation attributes, mitigation, and recovery, which will lead to utilities figuring out their system performance and in turn the social performance. There is no single metric for resilience. We are always evolving with more data, more needs, especially from different parts of the grid, like generation, transmission to end use, and also multi-objective formulations. We're looking at energy justice, energy equity, social burden. All of these need to be included when we're thinking about how we're measuring performance. Attribute metrics. The curated list here is from utility documents that we've looked at for different types of hazards. This will actually be published by GDO in the next month or two, where we're curating lists of utility metrics, their understanding of threat modeling risks for wildfire, hurricanes, and winter storms. For anticipation, let's say, an attribute metric would look like asset ignition probability if you're looking at wildfire as a hazard. For withstand, percentage of underground systems. For recovery, are you able to access the terrain and accessibility and terrain. Looking at the left part, are some of the questions that utility need to ask themselves when they're looking at metrics. Are attribute metrics used to characterize the strengths and weaknesses in their system? Are they collected to cover all four aspects of the resilience planning? Are they collected in a manner consistent with utility and industry standards? And in most cases, do we have standards to collect those metrics for different types of hazards? Are they used to guide their investment decisions? And then the data hygiene part, are they sufficiently high resolution? Is the coverage sufficient? Performance metrics, same curated list. Questions performance metrics. This is the important one. Are they defining performance metrics? What does it mean for them? Is it used to measure how well a utility is meeting its resilience objectives? This could include anything from just recovering from an event to equity to energy justice. Are the performance metrics used to track how well a utility is meeting all of those objectives? Are the resilience performance metrics applicable to all hazards, or there's developed with one specific hazard that is historical in their service territory? Again, data hygiene. This is a bit of an outdated slide, but it gives us a good overview of how disasters have increased and how they've had severe economic impacts since the 1980s when NOAA started collecting this data. The next presentations will go more depth into each of those disasters, but the key point here is that the frequency of natural disasters are increasing and the economic impacts are intensifying over time. So resilience is just going to become more important than it is now. All right. Here we're just talking about how we have a significant paradigm shift in the grid from where we produce power and send it to customers to a more prosumer environment where customers are generating power with their solar. They have home location batteries or electric vehicles. The reason that we bring up this slide is that the grid is evolving to becoming a more distributed, intelligent, complex system than we did 100 years ago. But about 70% of the grid is still over 100 years old. So we need to start thinking about that kind of infrastructure difference. All right, that's all of the definition of resilience terms, measuring it, metrics. From this point, we're going to look at a few different examples of solutions. These might not all be eligible for GDO or DOE funding, but it's good to think about the infrastructure interdependencies and come up with solutions that might be more effective. In the energy domain, we're thinking about energy efficient buildings, distributed energy resources that are located, how they can be interchangeably used in a disruption event scenario. Transportation, these systems rely heavily on energy from traffic signals to electric vehicles, so understanding where there can be fuel diversity or a resilient infrastructure like a porous pavement or reinforced bridges is necessary and important. We often forget that water systems rely heavily on energy systems to treat and distribute water. Some solutions could be conservation and storage, like a on-site water storage unit, gravity-fed system, and green infrastructures like biospheres. Information and communication system also needs to have secure architectures to reduce the potential of cyber attacks and putting analog backup system in case the digital system is not online. Cool. Last slide. Now that we've talked about all of that, these are questions from PUCs, state energy offices, and utility consumer advocates to ask to the utilities. This encompasses everything from how are they coming up with their plans, are they making their plans public, and are they engaging stakeholders? Do you feel like the information that they're presenting is based on resources that they adequately have? Do they need more resources to get to these questions? I want to pause here and go through these questions and kind of have a discussion from this point on. First one, what hazards, threats, or vulnerabilities are you most concerned with for your utility? This is a preliminary hazard characterization. This requires a lot of data crunching, both historic and future looking. Do they have the resources to get there? What tools do you use to assess hazards, threats, and vulnerabilities? This is again, do they have simulation tools that are not just historic looking, but also forward looking analysis? Are you prepared with your resilience plan? As in, are you able to share those with the public or at least with your state agencies? How do you involve stakeholders in developing these? The whole array of metrics. Are they actually tracking their investment portfolio? Are the costs for resilience investments shared with the state agencies and PUCs? Are they looking at risks and hazards holistically across the entire system and interdependent infrastructures? Are they using mitigation measures that are measured across the entire system? Okay, I'll pause here.